was waiting for the fins to be sealed, I also put in a fillet around the motor mount here, both on the outside and inside edges there. It's partially dry, and it's dry enough that we can go ahead and put the fins on. Now, one of the things we're going to need to do is make a little mark along our fin lines here, because the fins aren't going to go flush with the body tube. They're actually going to be 5 millimeters forward of it. So I'm just going to take my ruler here and a pencil, and we'll just go around. Okay, now it turns out that it's pretty close to where I put the fin lines to begin with, just the way it was wrapped. So I'm kind of overlapping a few other marks there. Now, while I'm doing this, I'm going to go ahead and check my launch lug lines. So I may as well mark these as well. Okay, so the launch lug is going to go at 6 inches or 15.2 centimeters from the aft end. Alright, so there's 15.2. Okay, and now I'm also going to use my fin here as a guide, and I'm going to mark the forwardmost part of it here. So just make a little tick mark there and go around. And this is going to give me a guide to sand a little bit of the tube. Okay, so here I'm just going to take a little bit of sandpaper. It can be anything from about 100 grit to 220. All we're going to do here is just roughen the surface along that line just a little bit. I'm just dragging it over the line. You don't need to do so much as to erase the line. If you do erase the line, just draw it back in. But all this is doing is taking the glossy finish off of the tube and giving a better surface for the glue to adhere. Alright, and that's all there is to that. We'll do the same thing with the launch lug later on. Okay, so we're going to start with one of these fins. Attach these with either wood glue or white glue. Okay, so I'm going to put a very thin bead of glue on here. In fact, that's too thick. I'm going to wipe some of that off. And if you're still a beginner at this, you're going to find that in general, a lot of glue is not good. It takes too long to dry. It's better to have some thin, uniform glue and then come back later and strengthen that. Alright, so I'm going to put that on my fin line where I roughened it and then pull it back off here, and I'm going to let this sit for about 30 to 60 seconds and then come back. It'll be tacky, and this will hold better than if we were to just do it with wet glue. About 30 seconds have passed, and now I'm just going to put the fin right back where I had it. I'm going to push that down, and the glue now has become much more tacky, and so it's going to stay in place while I measure to make sure that it's straight and perpendicular. You may want to use a fin alignment guide to make sure that all your fins go on at exactly 90-degree angles. You can also just eyeball it the way most people do. Okay, this is a guide made by Apogee Components, and they sell these as little kits that you put together, so you can see where the tabs and such are. And they make these for individual body tube sizes and also for either 3 or 4 fin configurations. Okay, so I can put mine in there, and I could tell it moved a little bit, so I wasn't quite perpendicular. And now I'm going to let that dry for about 5 minutes, and then I'll do the same thing all the way around here. The glue on all of my fins is drying, and now while I've got them all in the alignment guide here, I'm going to go ahead and mark and position the launch lug. So we'd already made a mark down here, and using the launch lug itself, put a little mark there. And just like we did with the fins, we're going to start by just scratching some of the surface here. Okay, be gentle while the fins are still drying. And then in the same way, we will attach the launch lug using wood glue or white glue. Although for this part you don't have to touch it and then wait for it to get tacky. We'll just put it right on. So I'm going to put on here a fairly even bead of glue. This can be a little heavier than the other because it doesn't have all the leverage pulling it down. Okay, and then we'll just press that on. And one of the reasons that I had wanted to have such a long launch lug line is it gives me a guide to sight down. Okay, so I can sight along this, making sure that it's straight. Okay, we've got a little bit of excess glue there. We'll just kind of push that into a fillet. We'll put true fillets on here later. Alright, check that for straightness again. I think we knocked it loose a little bit. Okay, I think that will do. And so we'll just let everything dry here. While the glue is setting on the fins, I'm going to turn my attention to the nose cone here. And first I'm going to take my hobby knife and cut out this little bit of flash. This is left over from the molding process. And we just want to cut around that piece. We don't want to cut through this outside piece that will be the eyelet for the parachute and the shock cord. Alright, and also make sure you don't cut your finger doing this. Alright, and that'll just pop out. And then if you look closely here, there are 2 seams where the nose cone was molded. And some people just ignore these, but if you want a really smooth finish, there are 2 things you can do. The first is to sand these. And so this is fairly trim already. They're not really prominent. So I'm just going to start with some 220 grit sandpaper here. And I'm going to sand along the seam. And this is going to take down any ridges. Okay, so that's smoother there. Up along here you might be able to see just a little bit of that seam left, and it's down in a valley there. And so that's where it's deeper than the average surface of the nose cone. If it's not too deep, you can just sand that out as well by lowering the surface around it. Okay, I'm going to come over here to the other seam and do the same thing, and then we'll see just what we have left. Okay, so that's knocked down most of it. I still see little bits of valleys here, but I think that'll be enough for my purposes. If you have really deep valleys, you can also use some plastic model contour putty. This one's by Testers. There are several other brands out there. You can find them at hobby shops. And those you just mold into the seams there, let it dry, and sand off the excess. Okay, now for the rest of this, I'm going to go ahead and continue sanding all the way around. And this will make the paint adhere better, as well as evening out the finish so that it all has the same general finish to it. Okay, and now I'm just going to take a couple of tissues here, and I'm going to moisten that with some rubbing alcohol. And I'm just going to use that to remove the sanding dust. Okay, so we can still see a bit of the seam there, but it's much less noticeable than before. And I'm going to just leave it at that. When I go to prime this, I'll use a sandable filler primer, and that will help hide any of the rest of the seams, as well as if I got any really deep scratch marks there. Okay, so I'm going to do that off camera, and when we come back, we'll put the fillets on the fins. The glue on my fins is dry, as well as mostly dry on the launch lug. And so I'm going to go ahead and apply fillets. And again, just like the glue we used for attaching the fins, you can use white glue or wood glue for this. So I'm going to go ahead and do the fins first and give the launch lug more time to dry there. So here I'm just going to apply a bead of glue. And I like to do facing fins at the same time like this. And I've got some paper towels ready to wipe my fingers on when I'm done. So here I'm just going to smooth this in. And try to catch any excess glue as we go along here. Now, as long as you keep the rocket horizontal, you can go ahead and move on to the next set of fillets here. You just don't want to stand it up vertically or the glue will run to that end. Alright, and I'm just going to leave this in a horizontal position to allow it to fully dry. All of my fillets are dry, and one of our last things to do then is to install the recovery system. So recall that the shock cord mount here is actually printed on the same piece of paper as the fin guide. And so here, once we've got the fins on, we don't need the guide anymore, and we can just cut this out. Again, if you don't want to cut this all up, you can always make photocopies and do that. Alright, then we need our shock cord out of the small parts bag. And that is a really small shock cord. Okay, if this is all if you don't have any spares laying around, you can go ahead and use this, but to me it seems rather short. I've actually got a longer piece of shock cord here from another kit that I didn't use, and I'm going to use that instead. Okay, the process is going to be the same, except that one's simply longer than the other. So I'm going to take my shock cord mount here. I'm just going to reorient it a little bit. then we're going to put a fairly heavy bead of glue across here. Alright, then I'm going to smear that around so we get a good even coat of glue and minimize air gaps. Alright, and then I'll put my shot cord here at a bit of an angle so that as it folds up here it does not get really thick upon itself. So now I'm going to just take the one and fold that over onto the two, and then fold the two over up onto the three. Alright, so here this is the reason I offset that, is that now most of the shot cord is laying beside itself instead of on top of itself here. Okay, go ahead and squish that around, get as much of the air out of that as you can. Then we're going to take some more glue, put that on here. Again, you want a fairly heavy amount because in the end we want a sandwich of paper, rubber, and glue with very little air in it. Alright, now I'm going to slide this in, and the idea here is to get this at least 1.5 inches down into the rocket so it doesn't interfere with the shot cord, or with the nose cone here. And I'm trying to get you a view down inside there. There you go, you can see that. So we want at least that far down. And now I'm going to flip this whole thing over so now the glue side is down. Alright, I'm just going to place my fingers down there as far as I can get them. So if you have long skinny fingers, this is a great job for you. And now what I'm doing is I'm pressing down on the inside of the body tube with the shot cord mount against my hand here. Okay, and I'm just methodically squeezing the air bubbles out of that. So that now when we look down here, I can't quite see it there. Okay, but that's nicely plastered against the wall. Okay, with very few air gaps. And now I'm just going to let this dry. And before we do the final assembly, I want to talk a little bit about paint and decals. So this is the suggested paint scheme here. So the entire rocket will be white, and then we would add some yellow here. And this is basically the yellow section here, except that the very top would be red. And then the fins and area around the fins would also be red. Okay, so that's one scheme. If you look online and look up the actual missile, there are a couple other schemes as well. One is to paint it basically a brown or an orangish brown, with the fin area a little bit darker, and with this stripe area up here also a little bit darker brown. But the main body and the nose cone would be brown as well. And then there's yet another one that uses kind of the same scheme, but oranges instead of brown. Okay, assuming that's supposed to be a test flight type. Okay, so this is my nose cone that's been primed here, and we were working on that earlier. So when you're ready to put this all together, you're going to take the shot cord here and tie it on with a double knot. Now I am not going to do this really tight because I prefer to do my painting with the nose cone off. Okay, but if you're going with the white scheme, you can paint the nose cone with it on there and then take it back off again and do the trim. Alright, but when you are ready for this, go ahead and pull that down tight and then apply a little dab of white or wood glue to that knot to keep it from slipping. The other thing you'll want to do is cut this back to about 5 millimeters or about 1/4 inch so it can't get up in between the shoulder of the nose cone and the body tube, because that can keep it from ejecting properly. Our final attachment is the parachute. Now I've detached the nose cone once again, and if you're going to directly tie your parachute to the nose as the instructions show, It's easier to do it if the shock cord is not attached first. Now, my personal preference is to use a snap swivel here that you can get in the fishing section of department and sporting goods stores. And so what I've got done here is I've simply taken the 3 loops of the shroud lines and gathered them on this finger. And then here I'm holding the parachute sheet by the middle. And all these corners should be coming down to approximately the same location, which they are. If they're not, you can kind of adjust the relative lengths here by adjusting how much is going around your finger. Okay, so if you're going to tie this directly to the nose cone, just put those loops through like this. Okay, and then you can take the entire nose cone, pass it through the loops, and then pull that taut. Now I'm not going to do that because it's really hard to get off again. All right, my preference is to put on the snap swivel here. So I'm gathering up my loops once more. Alright, and so once again, making sure everything's the same length. Now I'm going to hold on to the loop, so I'm never letting go of the strings down here while I'm doing the rest. Alright, I've always got at least one hand holding the strings in the same position. And now on the swivel end of my snap swivel here, I'm going to pass all of the loops of my parachute shrouds through the loop of that swivel. Okay. And I'm going to take the entire swivel and pass it through. All right, and then I'm going to pull the shroud loops down, and then I'm just going to pull that taut. All right, so it's going to look like this now. Check your lines once again to make sure they're still about where you wanted them. If they are, then we'll just add a little dab of glue right there to lock those in place. If they aren't, you can simply loosen that up and adjust the relative lengths. And now, whenever I'm ready, I can simply open up the snap part of this, put it around the eyelet, and snap it back into position. All right, and this is actually going to determine how big of a snap swivel you need. Okay, because this is a fairly lightweight rocket, and any snap swivel that'll fit on here will more than handle the load. But you want one that's got a big enough snap so that when it goes around the eyelet there, that it can move freely. Okay, so I'm going to leave that in pieces here for the moment and set aside the nose cone, and then I'm going to take my shock cord here. It's still drying, but for now I'm just going to loosely coil this up and put it back down inside, since it doesn't look like there's any exposed wet glue there. And this is just to keep it out of the way. Okay, and then I recommend either taking a few tissues or a paper towel or something and just stick that down inside so that the shock cord doesn't get loose and start wandering out there while we're doing the painting. Okay, so my next step here is to add a coat of primer to this, and then we'll add some paint and the decal. So I'm going to do most of that off camera, but I will show some intermediate steps as I go along. The main body and the nose have now been primed, and my next step is to put on a coat of white for both the body and the nose cone. At this point, I've put 3 coats of white paint on the main part of the rocket as well as on the nose cone. And I'm going to let this completely dry overnight, and then after that we'll mask off the areas that we want to keep white, and then go on to add the yellow and the red. The base white coat is finished. This has 3 layers of white paint on it, and my next step will be to mask off this center section, and then first paint the forward section yellow, and then mask it off except for the very top here, and then we'll apply red paint to the top and to the bottom fin area. Here I have the nose cone finished. It's just a basic white, and I've applied the yellow now to the top of the rocket, and I masked off to do the red for the bottom. But I'm going to wait until the yellow completely dries, and then I will mask off most of the yellow and just leave enough for the red stripe that goes across the top, and then we'll do the fins at the same time, as both are going to be red in color. Here I have the model fully masked and the last colors put on, the red in the fore and aft here. I'm going to allow this to dry overnight, and then we'll remove all the masking tape and paper, and we should be able to add the decals. My paint job is almost finished here. If you look closely there, the yellow has kind of a roughness to it, which means it was not completely dry when I masked it off. So it was dry to the touch, but it was still apparently a little bit soft there. Depending on where the decals are finally going to end up here, I can either sand this with some very fine sandpaper and clear coat it, or I can ignore it till after the decals and then clear coat it. But the masking job came out actually really well. Okay, looking at the suggested decal placement here, the ones that go in the yellow area are these double stripes here, and they are single piece. If this were a wrap going all the way around, I could probably get away with not doing anything about the yellow paint there, but I'm going to have to do that. So I'm going to go off camera and sand that with some very fine sandpaper, 320 to 400 grit, and then I'll give that a shot of clear coat, and that should fix the problem, I think. Sometimes bad results happen to the best of us, and I'm nowhere near the best of us. But we've got some crinkling here after sanding and clear coating. And so at this point, if this happens to you, really the best option is you go back, sand this down, and repaint it. I'm going to show you a little different option, kind of a cheat. It's going to take away some of the actual scale model detail of this. I have sanded down the crinkled part of my paint here, and then gave it a quick rinse with, not really a rinse, but a damp paper towel with a little bit of alcohol on it to remove the sanding dust. And what I'm going to do now to fix my little paint problem is to apply some vinyl sheet to it. And you can do this in place of painting here, so if you wanted to start at the beginning and just apply vinyl, you can do that, although you will still have to paint the fins. Theoretically you could vinyl the fins, but it'd be really difficult. Okay, you will still need to have the base coat of white underneath, even if you are just going to use this in place of painting here. So the first thing I need to do is cut a strip of this. Okay, and I know the red strip has to be 1 inch wide, and so fortunately my grid lines here are right at 1 inch. So now I can just take my hobby knife here and cut that. Alright, and now I can apply this outside in to see how much I'm going to need here. And I want just a little bit of overlap. I could almost, if I cut it here, I would get it edge to edge, but I'm always a little bit leery of that. So I'm going to cut it in between these two. So that I have a little bit of overlap there. Okay, now I'll just test wrap this before we do anything. Okay, so that one's good. The yellow, measure that here. I'm going to go ahead and use inches because that's what the grid is. This is 2 1/4 inches. Okay, so that's not going to give me a nice clean line. That's almost there. Let's try over here. Okay, so that's a little bit more than a quarter. And you can do this either by trying to get it exactly the right size there and just mate it edge to edge, or you can plan on having a little bit of overlap. And if I cut this down here, so that would be 2, 3, 4, 2 inches be there, and I'd have like a ½ an inch. So that's going to give me a little bit of overlap. Okay, and that's what I was saying, that this won't be quite to the scale colors, or at least to what Estes thinks they are. Because I'm going to make mine. Okay, I got that a little off straight there, but that's okay. I'll include that in the overlap. Okay, so now this, we also need to check circumference here. Alright, and with a little bit of overlap, that's actually enough overlap right there. So if I cut this one right here, it'll give me just a little bit of overlap. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this one and make sure. Good. Now here I have some room temperature water with just a drop of dishwashing liquid in it, and just about any dishwashing liquid will work. And this is why you need to have the base coat on, is because we're going to wet the vinyl decal here. Alright, and again, since I slipped a little here on this edge, it's not straight. So I'm going to use this edge here as my guide, and I'm going to wrap it right along the yellow there. So once I peel this off, got to keep track of which side I want where. Alright, so now I'm just going to dip this in the water and just kind of squeegee the excess out. And you want to have a couple of tissues or paper towels or something handy. Okay, and now I'm going to move that out of the way. Okay, and I prefer to have the overlap over on the launch lug side, so you won't see it on the launch pad. Okay, and I'm just going to run this just slightly over where that joint is. Okay, and I'm going to wrap it around here. I'm just a little bit off. Now I'm much more off here, but that's because of my cut. You know, in worst case scenario, you just go back and recut this. Alright, so I'm just going to bring this all the way back and just pivot it just a little bit on the corner. And you can hold tension on this as you go around. Okay, that's a little bit too much. There we go. Okay, and so now, once you've got that in place, take your towel or your tissues here and just squeegee out all the air and water. And after about 24 hours, this will become permanent. Alright, and now I can do the same thing with my red stripe. Now this one I did cut straight, so I can use either edge. And I'm going to line this one up with the edge of the body tube. Okay, now when we get to putting on the actual decals, we're going to use this same method. So here I'm going to start at that same spot, give or take. Alright, and I'm going to overlap just a little bit there. Okay, because what I want is for this edge to be flush with the edge of the body tube. Just like that. Okay. Now the drawback is you will see a seam here, and even if you get it exactly cut so it's edge to edge, you're still going to see a seam there, okay, that you normally wouldn't with a good paint job. Alright, the bonus though is you can reposition this. You can't do that with a paint job, and also this is going to be a little bit more scuff resistant than most spray paints are. Okay, so now just go through. If you got a bubble like that one right there and it won't work one way, just squish it another way. And you can even, you may even find that you got some bubbles after this dries, and just work them toward the edges. I'm going to let that set for just a few minutes here while I get the actual decals ready. Alright, we have the two main decals here, which are these complex stripes, and they're meant to go just at the edge of the yellow and also just at the edge of the red down the aft end. And theoretically, if you center one of these stripes along a fin, the other should be centered as well. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and kind of start with the fin closest to the launch lug and go around that way. Alright, I'm going to treat this like I did the vinyl decals there. Now this is going to look strange when it goes on. It'll look hazy and maybe kind of grayish. That goes away in about 48 hours or less. Okay, so here I'm going to line this up and just cover the edge of the red there. Okay, and I'm going to bring this around. Right, I'm just hitting the fin there, so I want to bring it up just a little bit. Okay. Oh, we got a little sticky there. We need a little more water there. Let's see if I can get that to come up without damage. Still not quite there. Really close. Okay, and so now, like I did with the vinyl, I'm going to go ahead and just take a tissue here and squeegee off the excess water. Okay, and now I'm going to get my fin marking guide. Actually, it's my tube marking guide. Okay, and I'm just going to pick an edge here. So many choices with this thing. Alright. Alright, so there's an edge of the black there. So now what I'm going to do is right up here, I'm going to make a little mark, just enough to see. And I'll use that so now when I put the other decal on, the stripes will be in line with each other. Okay, so we're going to take the other stripe decal. Actually, I need to bring my stripe down a little bit. Okay, because we've got that circular stripe going that way, so we need to come down just a smidgen here. I'm going to need a stand for this one so I don't stick it to my working surface here. Okay, I want it to be just at the edge of the yellow, and I will just cover my mark there. You come down a little bit. There we go. Okay, I'm going to squeegee that out. And actually, I don't even see a lot of the discoloration that I do sometimes with the Estes self-adhesive decals there. That looks pretty good. Alright, I'm going to let everything on here dry for a little while so that when we go to put on the other decals we don't accidentally lift one up. Okay, the next decals to go on are the U.S. Army decals here, and these are going to be centered between our two black lines here and on opposite sides. So I'm going to put one here, and then I will put one back here next to the launch lug. Okay, so just like before, we're going to dip this in the water. Okay, and I'm going to use the joint here of the two body tubes kind of as a guide. Okay, and then our last decals are these sort of double stripes here, and these are going to be lining up with the large stripes and the fins and be centered in between centered within the yellow area here. Alright, that does it for the decals, and now we just need to do some final assembly. I'm going to finish squeegeeing this stuff out and I'll come back in just a moment. The last thing we have to do is attach the shock cord to the nose cone and then attach the parachute. So for the shock cord, we're just going to tie a double knot in here. Alright, and pull that from multiple directions so that it cinches down nicely. Okay, and you might want to trim the little bit on the free end here. Trim that back to about 1/4 inch or 5 millimeters or so. Okay, and that'll just keep it from getting caught up against the shoulder here. But if you cut it way too far down against the knot, it's going to come unraveled. Okay, and then we can add a little drop of white glue or wood glue to that just to lock it in place. Just kind of work that into the knot there. It doesn't take much. And then our last piece to do is the parachute. So go ahead and unfold this, and then you're going to take the 3 loops of shroud lines here and just gather those up straight. Alright, and I'm going to put those on one finger here, and then I'm going to hold the middle of the parachute sheet itself. Okay, and then I'm going to pull this, and all of those corners should come down fairly close to being the same place. Feels like this has got maybe one that's a little bit longer than the others, but it's not drastically so. Alright, now according to the instructions, what they're going to have you do is take your loops of shroud lines here, place those through the eyelet of the nose cone. Alright, and then you have to regather them. Right, you're going to pull this through, and you're going to take the entire parachute and pass them through the loops, and then pull that taut. Now I'm not going to pull it all the way down because I don't like to do it this way. Alright, those of you who've seen any of my other videos know that I really prefer to put my parachutes on snap swivels. Alright, just like we did if you're going to tie it to the nose cone. Alright, find the center again, get all those loops at about the same length. And now I'm going to hold on to this. I don't want to let this go at any time or I'm going to lose the length of my loops. Alright, and here I've got a snap swivel. These come in lots of different colors and sizes. The main thing you need to have is one where the snap part of it here is large enough to fit over the eyelet and move freely. Okay, this is a fairly lightweight rocket, so the strength of the swivel will be fine no matter what the size is. Alright, so on the swivel side, I'm going to pass my loops through that. Okay, so here it's just hanging through, and I'm going to take the entire swivel and pass it up through the loops. Like that. I'm going to pull the loops down, and I'm still holding back here. Right, and I'm just going to pull that taut, like that. Recheck my shroud lines. And yeah, there is one that's longer than the others in here. That's due to Estes mismeasurement. Watch this. Oh, there, that was quick, wasn't it? Not much help to you guys, right? Okay, but it does still parachute correctly. And then once you've got this where you want it, and if you do want to adjust your shroud lines, you can simply untie this really easily at this point. But once you've got them where you want to, go ahead and put a dab of white glue or wood glue on that knot so that it doesn't come loose and change the length of your shroud lines. Just kind of work that in there. Okay, and now we just open up the snap part of this, all right, and attach this to the eyelet. And then close it down again. Okay, and what this does is two main things. One is the swivel part of this will help keep the shroud lines from winding up, and especially where this one's got kind of an odd size shroud line in there, it probably will twist a bit, but this will release that torsion on there because it can spin around the swivel itself. And then the other thing it does is allow you to quickly change parachutes. Some people don't like to store the parachute in the rocket, or you might want to put a bigger chute on or a smaller chute on, or maybe it's just a really windy day and you want to go with a streamer. Okay, this just allows quick change of your recovery system. So here I have the finished rocket. All of the internal pieces have been put in. We have all the decals on, and even with the tribulations we had with the paint earlier, this came out looking really nice. Note something down here. Now everybody knows my work address. Something I've gotten in the habit of doing is placing a label on a lot of my rockets so that if they get lost, hopefully some good Samaritan will find it for me and let me know that they've got it. Alright, hope you had fun building this. Have a great launch and a safe recovery, and please stay tuned for more of my videos.